Everybody. Dun 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 dun. Dun 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 dun. Dun 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 dun.
Watch the monitor.
Okay.
It's like a true story trooper, no door hit in your face. Keep over monitor.
Do you want to sit there and I'll...
We got a squished panel here to get a lot of I've got the mic set up down there.
I have a cord and stuff.
The lady stands still.
We're going to be a very cozy group here. So...
Microphones are hot.
Oh, hey, they actually
Hello.
Excellent.
Thank you to the 501st Troopers for escorting our special guest, Anthony Forreston. If you're here for the Star Trek panel, you came to the wrong place. Okay. This is for the love of Star Wars. We're going to start off with just having our panelists introduce themselves. We have more panelists than we have chairs, so we're going to start out with Tony, and just say your connection to Star Wars.
Well, my name is Tony Finkelstein. I'm a film producer, and my connection to Star Wars is fan. My name is Luis Diaz, and my connection to Star Wars is with the 501st, with the Rebel Legion, and also with Charlotte Fan Force.
And I'm Jada Diaz. I'm also with the 501st, the Rebel Legion, and with Fan Force.
I'm Anthony Forrest, and my connection to Star Wars is I was an actor in A New Hope. I played the Sand Trooper and also the Fixer in the now known as the Deleted Scenes.
I'm Sherilyn Lambeth, and I'm a longtime member of the 501st and the Rebel Legion.
My name's David B. Coe. I'm a fantasy author, and I have no idea what I'm doing up here, but I have seen the movies.
Right, I'm Nathan P. Butler, or Nathan Butler. I wrote a story for Star Wars Tales back in 2004, coming out with some action figures later this year for that story. I recently helped out with the Star Wars Essential Atlas, but my main claim to fame, I guess, is my 1,600-page Star Wars chronology, the Star Wars Timeline Gold, and I run StarWarsFanWorks.com, the home of Star Wars fan audio online.
And then our other panelists, I don't know if that one's working.
I'm Tom Hutchins. My relation to Star Wars, I'm the founder of the Mandalorian Mercs. We're the fourth largest Star Wars costuming club, and that's me.
Have you seen the movies?
Oh yeah, I've seen all the movies a few times.
All right, what I like to do when I start out this panel is find out the demographics of our audience. So, how many of you saw your very first Star Wars movie in the theaters 1977 to 1983? Okay, that's a good majority. How many of you for the first time saw your first Star Wars movie when the special editions were released in, okay, we have one person. Yeah. Okay.
Hold on. I was born in 82, but I remember growing up as like 3, 4, 5 years old watching Empire Strikes Back.
But you didn't see it on the big screen until probably in the mid-90s.
You're too young. Your first connection to Star Wars is reading the novel, not seeing the movie.
That's not what I'm talking about right now. You're getting off of my agenda. Okay, how many of you saw a Star Wars movie in the theater when the prequels came out, 1999 to 2005? Okay. Well, you already raised your hand once, Andy. Okay, and how many of you saw a Star Wars movie for the first time when the Clone Wars came out last year? Okay,
We're sorry.
Scotty's not in the room? All right, I don't think we have any next generations in here, which is unusual because we usually have a few. So, the Clone Wars has ushered in the next generation of Star Wars, and it's brought in a whole new realm of fandom. It's given all of us, original trilogy people a chance to really introduce our kids to Star Wars. So, and that's the way we all love George Lucas, and we love how he takes our money. So, There's lots of things going on in the Star Wars universe. Tom, you know a lot about what's coming up with Karen Travis's books, right?
Yeah, we've got a lot of Karen Travis books coming out. She's the one who, she's the author who did all the Republic Commando and 3 of the Legacy of the Force books. She's got the Imperial Commando, which is the continuation from Republic Commando. There's going to be coming out starting in November, the first one, which is labeled 501st. And she's also done the new Essential Guide to Star Wars Militaries, which has not hit the shelves yet. I'm not sure of a release date on that. And she's also in the process of writing a new Boba Fett novel. And then that's the last thing that I believe that she's got on her plate.
Okay. Do you know about any other books coming out?
Death Troopers is coming out in October. This is actually going to be the first Star Wars horror novel. Supposedly going to be a group of stormtroopers investigating something. One by one, they're getting picked off and getting killed, and they're trying to find out what it is. Basic horror plot, but it does look like it's going to be pretty interesting. If anybody's seen the cover, it is actually pretty graphic for a Star Wars book. It is a chain coming down with the hook going into the eyepiece of the stormtrooper helmet. But if you look very closely, you can see that there is a decapitated head still in the helmet.
I have a question. How is it that I've seen on a number of instances in Empire Strikes Back and then with the new movies, why is it that the head never comes? I mean, I understand, Lucas doesn't want to do it for kids, but is there any Star Wars logic for why the head does not?
Well, if you look at Jango Fett's head being severed in Episode 2, when it hits the ground, there's the shadow that looks like a head is coming out of the cut off helmet. I mean, it goes back to the same thing as for when people try to make fan films, and try to keep it PG because in the spirit of the film, it's supposed to be kind of the family-friendly thing. But there are instances where you can see it. It's just it's one of those blink and you'll miss it type of aspects to it. Speaking of the books, if I could add to what's coming out, they're in the middle right now of a new book series called Fate of the Jedi, which is set after Legacy of the Force, which is set 40 plus years after the classic trilogy. So they're pushing the timeline further. You also have a new Darth Bane novel coming out about the early Sith Lords. There's almost like there's 2 publishing approaches going on right now. You've got what we think of as the mainstream EU, the saga that's been growing since 1991, really.
What's the EU?
Expanded Universe. The Expanded Universe that's been growing since about 1991, novels, comics, video games, stuff like that. And then you've got the new Clone Wars television series stuff. And your Clone Wars television series stuff, I mean, if you're really wanting to get into that, it's accessible, it's easy to get into, kids can get into it really easily, but if you're looking for connections to the rest of the broader saga, they're not there, for the most part. On the other hand, Fate of the Jedi, Death Troopers, when it comes to the other stuff, the comics, the novels now that aren't Clone Wars, it's real hard to get into these for new fans in some cases because they're talking about characters that weren't in the films, the Solo children, the New Jedi Order, characters 4,000 years before the films, characters 100 years after the films like Cade Skywalker. You've got a stratification. If you're getting into the mainstream EU and you're a new fan, you may have some tough time to it. On the other hand, it's easy to get into Clone Wars, but it's not going to connect much. They've polarized it, I guess, now. But a lot of these that are coming out are some of the best in a very long time, especially some of Karen Travis's stuff, Fate of the Jedi.
Great, thank you, Nathan. Other things that, Nathan touched on you had another book.
Yeah, kind of on the fun side, I assume some of you have seen the visual dictionaries that they've come out with, and I assume that some of you have seen the Lego Star Wars video games that they come out with. They're actually coming out with a Lego Star Wars visual dictionary. It's supposed to be out later this year, probably sometime in the fall. And one other book, which he mentioned about the Fate of the Jedi series, which I actually heard some pretty good things about. Another book that had just come out recently, Luke Skywalker and the Shadows of Mindor, takes place shortly after Truce of Baccarat, which is the...
Awesome.
Yes, very good book, although some people did. But Truce at Baccarat is a story that takes place just a few months after Return of the Jedi. So if anybody's been kind of following the storyline with like most of the newer books like Legacy of the Force, that's like 40 years after. This one's kind of going back in time a little bit. I don't know too much about the plot, but I've also heard that that is a pretty good book as well. And that one is out now.
Yeah, that's one of the few that are out right now that you can easily jump into. With regard to like the comic books and such like that, you've got one Knights of the Old Republic set thousands of years ago, Legacy set 100 or so years in the future. There was one a lot of fans were using as a way to get into it called Rebellion, but Rebellion is now canceled to make room for the new Jedi Order 25 plus years after story called Invasion that's being put out in comic book form. So the one really accessible mainstream EU comic series is now gone.
Dark Times is still going.
Dark Times is still going, but Dark Times it's kind of tough to get into, at least for me, but Dark Times focuses on, for the most part, characters that also weren't in the films. Vader's in there sporadically, but for the most part, it's a smuggling ship's crew and a fallen or a surviving Jedi from Order 66 who's trying to redeem himself. There's not a lot of easy to access stuff in Dark Times either. For better or worse, great stories, broadly speaking, but not very accessible.
And there's also the Clone Wars comics that have come out, and those are great for kids and adults. It's family reading for us. So some of the other things that are going on in the Star Wars world is minis. A very addicting game. If you've ever played it, it's lots of fun. RPG, of course, they have the D20 game out now. Trading cards are huge. We have an LFL artist here in Artist Alley, Rich Molinelli, and so you can go by and see some of his cards. And video games, of course, are huge. And collecting, you can go broke collecting. So, and I'm proud to say that they even came out with a figure that I costume, Yarna. So, and how many of you follow the Clone Wars cartoons? Okay, a good portion of you. So we've seen the first season. They've released the video of the first 4, and that will be coming back on in the fall. What they're doing now is they're doing decoded episodes, where they're going through and telling you more, having pop-ups on the screen and telling you more about the episode. So, that's kind of fun to watch, and especially if you're watching it with the kids, it gives you more information. It's giving them more information. So, okay, big topic. We're going to. Do you have anything else you'd like
I was going to say, if you are at one angle we didn't touch on, video games.
Okay.
Kids, as far as getting kids interested in it. There's been the recent major multimedia, the Force Unleashed event on all the different systems, and there's also now a lightsaber duels video game on the Wii, where you're literally kind of swinging the Wii remote around. It's not a one-to-one thing, but it's decent, I guess. Nintendo DS has a game for the Clone Wars, and Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 is about to get one. So if you're looking to draw kids into it, that's another avenue. Clone Wars isn't just the comics and the television series. They've actually got video games to pull people in now. We know, that's a lot of times where kids are coming from.
All right. Tom, do you have anything else on video games or RPGs, minis? Okay.
I don't play video games.
One of the things that we were going to talk about is an issue that's come up in fandom ever since the prequels came out, and that's people who love the prequels and people who hate the prequels. So we're going to do this very civilized, and I wanted to ask the panelists, their position on, the prequels. We'll start with Tom.
It's actually funny that you bring that up, because we just did an interview on our Mercs. We do a podcast on Mercs called Mando Ade, and we just interviewed our regional commander from South America, and that was one of the questions I asked her, was how she felt about the old movies as opposed to the new movies. And she actually likes the old movies. She doesn't really like the new, the new stuff 1 through 3. And I'm almost the same opinion. I lean more towards New Hope through Return of the Jedi, just because that's what I grew up on. And to me, it looks more real. It looks gritty. It's, you look like you can actually touch the Star Destroyers and the ships, whereas the new stuff, there's too much CGI. It's just too imagination looking.
Nathan?
I guess I am I'm a fan of all. I mean, to me, it's all one story anyway. But I have always been one, whether it's reading Hamlet or anything else, I've been big on tragedy. So to me, Revenge of the Phantom Menace is the oddball. It's the one that just kind of doesn't belong. You can sing one of these things is not like the other song for it. It doesn't fit. But the others feel like one saga. So to me, Revenge of the Sith wound up being my favorite film out of all of them. Though I did see it after reading Matthew Stover's great novelization, it added some more depth beyond what we see on screen, which may have colored that perception. But no, I'm one of those fans who particularly enjoys the prequels. I haven't seen them as much as the classics, but that's only because I haven't had decades to do it. When I pop in a Star Wars movie now, though, usually it's Revenge of the Sith.
David?
I'm a big fan of the original three, the classics, I guess. I think that they were brilliant. I think that they drew on all sorts of storytelling tropes. They worked on so many levels. The prequels to me were glitz and little else, and they just did nothing for me.
Sharon?
Yes, I have to agree. I love the original trilogy better than the new ones. And for me, the reasons that Tom mentioned, they look realistic, they look lived in. The CGI is very clean and precise and clear-cut, and someone pointed out, well, the Republic back at that time was better. When the Empire took over, things did fall downhill. But it seemed much less realistic to me than the dirty, lived-in universe of the original three.
That was when the Empire took over, things went downhill, in your opinion.
That would be the rebellion's opinion, I think.
As she sits here,
Good save.
as she sits here in an Imperial Commander's office. Now, this is an opinion that I think we're all interested in, is hearing Anthony's opinion on the prequels versus the old trilogy, original trilogy.
Yeah, this is interesting because I have the opportunity to travel around to some of the conventions and hear a lot of opinions, and people have come up to me. And it's a common question. Is I suppose one reason is because there was a time lapse between each set of films. I kind of look at these things also from a filmmaking point of view, and also when you're around the industry and you're involved in the industry. And so I think what a lot of us feel, and I will go along with most people, is the fact that what is it about the first three that seems to embrace us more and keep us involved in the story, or why we remember these stories and why they're closer to our hearts, perhaps. And one of the things that we're dealing with, and this is to do with a lot of films, not only Star Wars, is we're dealing with technical changes that we're experiencing. And when you get into the digital domain, is you're dealing in a very different perception that the human eye has and what we receive. Is the originals were all shot on film, and as the new films started to come out, they were being made in high definition. And one of the things that George is fantastic at, it's delving into new technology. And so when you delve into new technology, you take that risk of, in one way or another, alienating what people have come to know and love. And so one of the things that we experience with the human eye, with the new technology, is the hardness of the image. One of the things, because you're shifting from a chemical process, which is film, into a digital process. And film has this very forgiving ability, it's like a painting in a way, where its saturation is very high. And so the human eye really likes the quality of that saturation. And when you talk about the depth of the film and the graininess and that is very pleasing to us when we look at it, when we experience it. And so when we see the newer films that are all done, and this is a big debate between cinematographers and filmmakers and producers. Producers want to make films in the digital domain simply because the cost is far less in those stages of the production, and especially when you get into post-production and you're doing special effects. cinematographers want to work in film because that is their craft and that is their love, and they have much more control over film than they do over the digital process, because I've worked with the best of the high definition cameras, and they are very unforgiving in terms of, they're fantastic for sporting events. You can see the hair on a tennis ball as it crosses a net, but in terms of atmosphere and in terms of the nuances of expression in that, they're very unforgiving, and so that is one of the things I think we experience. The other aspect is when you're filming, and I actually experienced this when there was a screening, and there were a lot of the original, John Dykstra and a lot of the original special effects guys were there who worked on the first film, and George was there were other people there. And when the film came up, it was a digitally cleaned copy of the film. And all the guys who worked on the original film started yelling, "Where's the film? Where's the film?" They wanted to see this. They wanted to see the grain. They wanted to see the scratchiness. They wanted to see what was the film that they had worked on before it all being digitally cleaned and enhanced. And so it's one of those things. I suppose it's a little like when we look at a painting and we see it, and it's an old painting. We appreciate it for what it was when it was made at the time. I think that one of the dangers is when you're working in and dealing with a lot of technology. I think one of the things you have to be very careful of is that character and story do not suffer. Story and character really have to come first. This is my personal opinion in terms of storytelling, especially in film. It really is in terms of storytelling in all the genres that we deal with in storytelling. And what happens is when you're dealing with new technologies, we are naturally enamored by these new technologies to want to play with them. And sometimes we play with them too much. And that's, I think, one of the things that when the second set of films were being made, there were all these new technological advancements that were there, and George had the opportunity to play with them. And what do we do when we get new toys? We play to an extent that sometimes we forget about other things. So I know there's been questions from fans about, for instance, actors' performances and things like this. And so these are issues that you sacrifice, you make sacrifices when you deal with things. And so I think that perhaps on the new set of films there were certain sacrifices made in order to explore the new technology, whereas the first set of films were much more focused on story and character and dealing with those issues as opposed to trying to wrap yourself around dealing with the new technology as a filmmaker. My 2 cents.
That was a great answer. Thank you. What did you say? I grew up on the old trilogy. I spent my entire summer of 1977 riding my bike down to the cinemas in Greenwich, Connecticut, seeing the trilogy for free, or not the trilogy, the movie for free, because my friend's brother worked at the cinema. I was hooked. I wanted to be Princess Leia, but somehow got talked into dressing up as Luke Skywalker. That was my first costume. My friend dressed up as Darth Vader. We went to a restaurant. I love the old trilogies. In fact, to go to sleep, sometimes he has to pop in Empire for me because I need the breathing of Darth Vader to lull me to sleep.
I think there are 900 numbers you can call for that sort of thing.
It's not as rhythmic, it's just not as rhythmic, and plus it's cheaper. So, I look at the prequel trilogies on their own. I set them aside, and I like them for what they are. And I agree with a lot of the CGI but it gave us a whole new set of costumes. For those of us who liked costume, it gave people a whole new set of characters to love or hate. It took some of our characters back to when they were younger, and I enjoyed seeing that. Again, I liked reading the novelizations too because, you know, I'm a big reader, so. But my favorite is the original trilogy.
I'm another one who grew up on the original trilogy. Pretty much if it wasn't for the first Star Wars movie, I wouldn't be sitting up here dressed like this. It was, you know, a lot of people said the same thing. They sit there, they see the opening crawl, they see the Star Destroyer, and that's it. They're just completely hooked from that point. I was hooked from that point. Then you have the point when the stormtroopers come in and Vader walks in, and from that point there, that made me a fan for life. So much so that I actually have Darth Vader tattooed on my arm. That's how committed, or he was my favorite character. I think that the original trilogy movies were, that kind of defined the story. The prequels, Empire Strikes Back, at least personally, I think is my favorite out of the original movies. As far as the prequels are concerned, I was just happy to have a Star Wars movie coming out, finally, after all that time.
Yes.
You know, and I don't know, has anybody here seen Fanboys? More people than I thought. Given the small release, that's a lot more people than I thought. It's the last line of the movie. They're all psyched for the movie, and they're like, oh, what if it sucks? It was good. I had seen it numerous times, probably about 7 or 8 times in the theater when it was out. The good thing, though, is that the rest of the movie is kind of built off of Phantom Menace and got better. I would actually, my opinion is that Revenge of the Sith was my favorite out of those, and probably comes in about third as far as, you know, which movies are my favorite. What he was saying before about the whole tragic hero story in Revenge of the Sith is what really drew me into that movie. But still, I still will always go back to the original movies. Those will always be my favorite.
Okay, well, in my opinion, the new movies was simply George Lucas needed more money. There was no need for the first three, or the new ones that they made. The original Star Wars, or I don't know the classic Star Wars. Original trilogy. There was, you have the ensemble cast, and you get the feeling that they are a family, that they are connected, that they're not just there. And when you don't have the same camaraderie in the new films, you don't have the one looking out for the other. It's you know, it's the new ones are very tinny, very bland.
Okay. Go ahead.
What works last night in the discussion about writing, there's a guy here named Ed Schubert who is the editor of Orson Scott Card's Intergalactic Medicine Show. He's a great editor, he's a great writer. One of the things he said was, sometimes what works best in a story is taking a storytelling trope, a cliche, and turning it on its head. And to me, that was what the entire original trilogy was about. The original trilogy, to me, is the King Arthur legend, taken forward in time 1,000 years. You know, the young man who must master the sword in order to assume his place in the pantheon of leaders of whatever. But the whole thing is done tongue-in-cheek. There is humor throughout, and one of the things that didn't work for me in the second trilogy was that it seemed to take itself so seriously from the very start.
Very cold.
And the nods at humor were gratuitous. They weren't an integral part of the story the way they were in that original series.
Yeah, they were very cold.
If I could toss in a couple of quick items there is three quick items. One, there is a special, if you're interested in the background comparisons, things like King Arthur, called Star Wars The Legacy Revealed, that History Channel put out a few years ago. It's hard to find. There are clips of it around. They still haven't put it out on DVD or anything, but that's a great one to check out and it's really an in-depth type of study to it. Second thought, if there's any podcasters in the crowd, you mentioned technology. One thing we got to remember is Star Wars' impact was well beyond just the films themselves, because if you do any type of podcasting or video editing and you're not doing it on film by taping or connecting stuff together, any non-linear editing, as it's called, comes from Edit Droid and Mix Droid, which were Skywalker sound creations created during the process of making A New Hope. And third, I do find it a little odd, we're up here kind of poking at the prequels. A couple years ago, James, here in the audience, and I were on a panel about this very topic, the prequels versus classic, and at that time there was no Clone Wars cartoon, or at least the new one. I'm hearing fans who are now defending The Phantom Menace in the process of bashing the Clone Wars, or at least saying, like the voice actor for Jar Jar Binks outside of a couple of episodes is different, and he sounds different. And people say, man, I wish we could go back to Ahmed Best from episode 1. And I don't think we've ever heard that before.
Wow. You know the old Jar Jar back.
Yeah, they love the fact that they had the sounds are now in their heads, so to speak. That is one thing Star Wars has done, is the characters, whichever trilogy you're looking at, the looks, they're so iconic, even though they are based on old tropes that have been around since, just verbal storytelling. They're so iconic that once you've seen it, it's ingrained. It's not like any other movie where you have a tendency to see it, and then later on you may remember story points, but there's not one thing that just latches on and iconically you'll know that phrase, that tone of voice, that annoying Jar Jar character's tone of voice. That's Star Wars. Most films don't do that.
Well, the one thing that the new films did give us was Jar Jar. Other than that, there was,
That's not really
Jar
good.
Jar and costumes. I believe Cher has a comment.
Well, actually, I was going to say, someone brought up the point, actually many people on the panel brought up the point that the original Star Wars was our childhood and what we grew up with. And I have to wonder if one of the reasons the new trilogies have not been as popular in fandom is because it's not what we envisioned. When we first saw Star Wars, I did, I'm sure many other people did too, thought, okay, wow, well now what happens with Han and Luke and Leia? Now where do they go? Now what happens to the Empire? We all came up with our own ideas, fan fiction, fan audio, yes, exactly, as to what happened next. And so, or what came before. So when George presented us with his vision of it, we're like, well, that's not what I thought at all. But now we have had an opportunity to grow accustomed to that and to see the new things that are coming out, like Clone Wars, and I think it helps smooth the transition a little bit.
Well, for what it's worth, the prequels aren't even what George Lucas envisioned in the first place. No matter what he may say, the one film saga, 12 films starting with A New Hope, 9 films with A New Hope as 4, now it's 6 films with A New Hope as 4. That was always the intention. You can look at some of the earliest licensed products, like the early RPG or the early Star Wars Guide to the Star Wars universe. There were some small tidbits of information that George Lucas gave to the writers of those, or gave to Lucasfilm to give to the writers to flesh out their materials. The age of Darth Vader is different. Some of the aspects of the Clone Wars are different. There's all this controversy looking back at Timothy Zahn's first EU novels, the Thrawn trilogy, because, they got the dates for the Clone Wars wrong. Those are the dates Lucas gave Lucasfilm to give him in the first place. Lucas changed his mind later. So I'm not sure that there is, even with our childhood, we look at it and say, this isn't what we expected. I'm not sure if even Lucas himself would say this is what he expected when going through the process of creating the film. I think it's a much more organic process, even for him, than we often like to give it credit for. We like to think that there was something written years ago that just laid every single bit out,
I guess my problem was I didn't grow up with it. I was already an adult when it came out.
I mean, the whole process of filmmaking in itself is as producers would love it to be nailed down to the absolute cent and dollar. It is a very organic process because you're going through those 3 different stages, which are very separate. One is the writing stage, one is the production stage, and the last stage being the post-production stage. And so you're making your projects 3 times over, really. And each project has so much input from all different departments that there are a lot of influences. And as you talk about it, I don't think things are necessarily set in stone. The original screenplay didn't talk about sand troopers and stormtroopers. It basically said troopers. And so these things were all, as the universe kept expanding, all of these ideas kept expanding, and new people joined the team, and new ideas keep coming to the process. And so when somebody contributes something, it's Lucasfilm will say, that's a great idea, let's go with that, that works for this. And so there is that continual thing, and that's why, there's an awful lot of people involved in the process at the same time. So it is, I don't think everything is it's not all written in stone, as some people might imagine.
Yeah.
We have some questions.
The only thing I would add, I think every point is valid. The only difference, I think, this will go to play to David's part, I think, in having a good editor. Because George, when he became the genius George Lucas who made Star Wars, he had Rick McCallum, who's not a buffer. He said, whatever you want, George, go, And so George, he had to fight tooth and nail for a lot of stuff in the original trilogy. And he had other screenwriters, and people there say, this isn't going to work, let's change it. And so he didn't have that buffer, so I think it's a lesson for writers in that if you don't have anything to challenge you, you're not going to get your best stuff. And so I think we see a lot of that in the story in the prequels is without that buffer George left to his own devices isn't challenged, and therefore the finished product is not as refined as the originals.
I think it's a point that's not often spoken about, but I think it's a point worth taking a moment to talk about. Is Marcia Lucas is a brilliant editor, and she was there all the way through from the beginning. GHX 1138, American Graffiti, New Hope. She was there all the way through, even into Raiders of the Lost Ark. And I think she quite often gets overlooked in terms of her contribution to these things.
You can see, talking about the organic growing, there is a fandom project out there called Deleted Magic. You find clips of it on YouTube and other places, but Deleted Magic does a great job of going back and any lost scenes, any early production photos, like the earliest land speeder scenes that were just, they were projecting in the background. They were projecting the background zipping by behind us. They're sitting there bouncing. It kind of felt old-timey Star Trek-like to an extent. But Deleted Magic does a very good job of showing that organic process, what could have been if these scenes hadn't been edited differently, hadn't been rewritten, reacted later on. It's a brilliant thing if you get a chance to see it. And I know there's one for Empire, there's one for Jedi too, and I'm sure they're on YouTube still at this point. But it's almost like a documentary of how would, and it goes through the entire film, beginning to end. How would this have been different, this have been different, this have been different, all the way up through a re-editing of the Battle of Yavin the way it was originally constructed using, I guess it was World War II movie footage, side by side whenever Lucas used that as his sort of an old style animatic to figure out what he wanted to do. So I'd highly recommend Deleted Magic if you're into the creative process.
Thank you, Nathan. You had a question?
Well, I just want to kind of add to what he was saying with Gary Kurtz kind of as kind of a balance for Lucas. I think a lot of people will remember, but Lawrence Kasdan was actually asked by Lucas prior to starting the prequels to come aboard and help write the scripts. And Kasdan turned out, if anybody doesn't know, Kasdan co-wrote screenplays for Empire and Return of the Jedi. And Lawrence Kasdan flat out said no, because he said, and I'm kind of paraphrasing what he said, I don't know for a while, but he basically told Lucas, look, you weren't happy with Empire and Jedi, because they weren't your movies. The only way you're going to be happy with prequels is if you go out and you make your movie. And I think that had a lot to do with Lucas writing screenplays for all three, except for a little episode 2, and also directing all three, because he didn't have that input into Empire and Jedi like he really wanted to. And so I don't think it's so much that he had a balance on the prequels, is that he just kind of saw what he really wanted to do with the original trilogy. And who knows what we would have had.
Well, I don't want to get stoned here, but doesn't that kind of discount his just making a random comment? Like
That's nice. That's what I was thinking up here at the time. Is if it took other people to make it work better, then is there the creative genius there? Which is a valid point. We keep talking about the prequels. The weakest of the prequels, I think, is the kind of consensus is the Phantom Menace was the weakest of the prequels, or at least it was the oddball of the prequels. What's the only one where he didn't bring Jonathan Hales on to help with the script? Episode 1. So again, there's a level of connection.
He did bring on Carrie Fisher to do some polishing work on it, and he also showed it to Frank Oz, and Frank Oz said it's fine to do well.
Yeah, I think a sign of genius too is the fact that you know to get good people around you
Yes.
as well, not just your own creative input, but people who can help you.
Plus, he has all our money, so he's Mr. Lacy.
Anthony,
Yes.
question for you. When you watch, you look back at what you did, and when you watch some of the documentary on the film, the attitude of the English crew, you know, they were saying, what are we making? What was your thought on that when you first walked on the set? Were you like, what were we making, or did you know something special was happening?
I had a chance to read the script before I started working. I mean, nowadays a lot of times when you're doing smaller roles, they just send you the sides of the scenes you do. They don't necessarily send you. I mean, it's probably to do with the green approach, not sending a whole screenplay, same pages. But I had a chance to read the script. Also, I'd been in England for a while, but I'd had the opportunity to see American Graffiti. So I understood that George had a sense of humor, and he also understood filmmaking. And so when I was reading the script, I think one of the things and this is just a little bit of my own information here, is a lot of the people who, around that time, a lot of the young filmmakers, George Lucas, Steven Spielberg, Brian De Palma, another one was Richard Donner. And I suppose 3 films were really being made around that time. They were all very closely linked in an unusual way, and they were all closely linked to Space Odyssey 2001, which had an enormous influence on young filmmakers. There were the next generation after Kubrick that were coming along, because it was 2001 was kind of that film that took you for the first time really to space, and it took us our universe really did start to expand with that. One, because the special effects were so brilliantly done, and so everybody went after Spielberg, George Lucas, Richard Donner. They all went to try and get the crew and the people who had worked on 2001 to work on their projects. So you had Douglas Trumbull, who was supervising special effects on 2001. Spielberg grabbed him, and he went on to work on Close Encounters. George couldn't get Douglas Trumbull, but he got John Dykstra, who was the assistant to Douglas Trumbull on 2001. The same thing with the cinematographer. Jeffrey Unsworth was the cinematographer on 2001. Richard Donner grabbed him to do Superman. And Richard Donner was very open about saying that he really credits Jeffrey Unsworth for the brilliance of managing to make Superman fly, making it look and feel real. And so there was an awful lot of so the British crew at that time a lot of them had been working around or worked on some very interesting Kubrick films. Also, a lot of them had a long history, and so I don't know if we don't often see pictures of George back in the day, but he was to many people in the film world, he was like a skinny kid coming into, from the stage to make a movie. And a lot of those filmmakers who were on the crew and the technicians in that had years and years of experience already working on films in England and that. So for them, that was the question, especially if you look at the screenplay and you see all of a sudden you're working in live action and then you're switching across to something in space, which is special effects. And that was one of the groundbreaking things about Star Wars, is the fact that the special effects took us to a whole new arena. It opened up a whole new gateway in filmmaking. And so that was one of the things I think the crew had. Also, the other thing is the fact George is quite quiet and shy. He's not a director that goes around yelling at people and saying he wants this and wants that. And I must admit, having done a few films over the years and directed myself in that, one of the things that is really the most difficult job as a director is because you have an awful lot of people coming at you asking questions all the time, is to stay true to your vision. And that is one of the things that George was really very good at. He had a vision and he stayed as true as possible to that vision. Even though all these people were saying, do it this way, do it that way. He really understood, he had a vision in his mind of really what he wanted to try and create and the universe that he wanted to try and create. And that is a continual battle that you fight as a director or as a filmmaker when you have an awful lot of people around you saying, do this, do that, try it this way, try it that way. And so I think that, you know, it is a, because I know there have been, you know, discussions and people talking about, you know, they said at the time it looked like George didn't know what he was doing. He knew what he wanted to try and create, and it was really trying, it's always a battle to get people heading in that same direction and to be that leader. And I think, you know, also he was very, as you mentioned, he was very smart. He gets really good people around him. And he recognizes talent, and he gets very talented people to work with him, which is always a good mark in terms of that. That's a genius in itself.
Okay, something else that's coming up, thank you. Something else that's coming up is the live action TV series. And Lewis has done a lot of research on this for us, so he's going to hit the highlights.
Right now the series is untitled. They are in preliminary script writing. They have about a half a dozen or so script writers that are starting to work on scripts. They're looking at probably pre-production the end of this year, going into full production next year. Hopefully the series will be out fall of 2011. They are, I don't know if anybody had seen what they were doing with the Clone Wars series, but they said, we're going to do a whole bunch of episodes and we'll release them a season at a time. And we're wanting to work on 100 episodes at first. They got probably, for Clone Wars, they got about half of those done already. They're still working on those. They're wanting to do the same thing with the live action series. They're looking at starting with 100 episodes. Although George Lucas, Rick McCallum both said they can conceivably see this going for as long as 400 episodes. They're also talking about it possibly branching. It's going to focus on minor characters. Any of the major characters from the movie are not going to be featured in the series. You may have a cameo appearance by some major characters. You will not see Palpatine, you will not see Vader. They'll talk about them. The stories are taking place where Vader and Palpatine, they're not there. They're not in the same place where the stories are taking place. They're looking at the possibility of having certain characters and focusing on stories with them, and then the possibility of it branching off into maybe 3 or 4 separate shows, kind of similar to what they were doing with Star Trek, like with the Next Generation, kind of branching off into Deep Space Nine. The time period is going to be from the end of episode 3 up until the start of episode 4. They're looking at covering, if you remember in the opening crawl for episode 4, they talk about the rebels having their first major battle. That's something that they're wanting to show in the series. They're talking about, there's a very good chance that one of the characters that may be sort of featured in there kind of heavily is Boba Fett. So there's also talk that they may try to get Dan Logan, who portrayed young Boba Fett in episode 2, they may have him portraying Boba Fett in the series. That's kind of...
Have you talked to Dan about that?
Last time I talked to him, he said that, you know, that it wasn't a confirmed thing, and that, you know, it's just a rumor at this point. But I know that his dad, who is also his manager, has been working very hard to get him into that role. You know, so it wouldn't surprise me if that role does go to him.
One of the things that they had talked about, I don't know how many of you remember, this is going back like early 90s, when George Lucas and Rick McCallum were doing the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles. Their production that they're going to be doing for this series is going to be very similar to what they were doing with that, as far as production value, how well they're planning on doing the production. They're going to try to, you know, do something that would cost $20 million, they're going to, what would look like cost $20 million, they're going to try to do for $1 million.
So they're going to do a digital.
Or make it on Mac in somebody's basement.
Okay.
Yeah, most likely. Another thing, if anybody's who's into Jedis and into some of the expanded universe stuff, there's also talk about them possibly bringing back the Quinlan Voss Jedi character. They were talking about in one of the comic series, the writer was wanting to kill off Quinlan Voss, and Lucas specifically told him not to. So it looks like they may be wanting to use his character in the series.
Quinlan Voss, you see him briefly in Mos Espa in episode 1, very briefly. That John Ostrander, when writing Republic, was trying to kill him off. They did actually kill him off in the comic book adaptation of Revenge of the Sith, but then they went back and said, you know, that scene, just ignore it. It's the old retcon aspect, which is now what they're having to do. The great thing about the live action series, whenever it finally comes out, is when it takes place. Aside from a couple of books and The Force Unleashed, there's not a lot in that gap between the trilogies. Lucas has left that hands off. As opposed to the Clone Wars, which is now running roughshod over 3 years of very dense novel, comic, and video game continuity, where there's a story about every month or so that's now being trampled upon, and now the Lucasfilm representative, Leland Chee, love him to death. The guy helped me out. We were doing the Atlas stuff, showed me part of the holocron, loved it, great guy, but he's now the guy who, based on their policy of everything's got to fit, has to say, oh my God, how do I make 3 years of stories that had no Ahsoka into something that makes all these stories work together? And it's become a major, major problem continuity-wise that they're not going to give us an answer to till after the 100 episodes are all at least written. The new series has the potential to go in a lot of different directions without that type of fan backlash because of the era that it's in. So of anything, it's probably got the most potential.
One other thing, and I think Cher is going to like this. The author A.C. Crispin had talked to Lucas about wanting to do a novel that did a backstory of Princess Leia between episode 3 and episode 4. And he basically said no, he wanted to leave that untouched because they're going to cover her backstory in the TV series.
But she's a major character, you already said.
Right.
They're going to cover her story in cameos.
All right, well, we're getting close to time to wrap up, so I wanted to ask one last question of the panel. Who is your favorite Star Wars character? And we'll start with Tom.
Gosh, I guess I got to kind of split mine between Boba and Jango Fett.
Well, aren't they kind of the same?
They're kind of the same anyway, so yeah, I guess I can't help one without loving the other.
One's blue, one's green.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm going to have to split the answer because if it was the films, I would say Anakin. I like the tragic fall aspect of the character. On the other hand, if you're talking broadly speaking, Ulic Qel-Droma, another tragic character from the old Tales of the Jedi comics who has a much more complete, less jerky character arc of tragedy and redemption. I should probably say Kyle Katarn because that's whose story I wrote recently, but Kyle doesn't, it always annoys people, but Kyle's not the guy. Ulic Qel-Droma, if you ever get a chance to check out the Tales of the Jedi comic books.
David?
Yoda, my favorite character, would be.
I guess I'd say, in spite of the fact I'm dressed as an Imperial, Princess Leia would have to be my favorite character. It was a good, strong female role model for a lot of girls growing up at that time. And I really liked her character.
I was going to actually say Yoda as well because I've had some time to spend with Yoda's voice, Tom Kane. And Tom does a fantastic Morgan Freeman impersonation.
My favorite character from the movies is R2-D2 because R2 is always in the right place at the right time and does the right thing.
A lot of people would actually say he's the hero.
He is the hero.
Of all the movies.
He is the hero of the movies.
And I would probably say, as far as Imperial characters are concerned, definitely Vader is my favorite. If I had to pick somebody from the good guys or the rebels, would be Han Solo. I just like his attitude. Plus, he gets Leia in the end. So.
And then he comes in Indiana Jones.
Yeah.
Mine would be Han Solo, simply because you see him in the beginning as irresponsible rascal, and you see him mature in age without losing the qualities he had in the beginning.
Okay. And one question for the audience. Who shot first?
Aye.
Is there anybody in this audience who thinks that Greedo shot first?
The Greedo shot first, the Greedo Han.
No. Okay. Well, we're going to wrap up the panel, and everybody is invited to participate in the 501st Droid Hunt. If you haven't gone by the table, go by the table, get yourself a droid badge. We're going to start at noon, end at 5:01, be at the table. We're going to raffle off some great prizes, including a sideshow collectible Anakin Skywalker statue. So thank you very much, and I'd like to thank all my panelists. Wait, Tom has,
Also, the January merch we're doing a jail and bail for charity. So if you have a friend that you would like to see jailed, just come by the table and we'll set you up with getting them put in our jail.
Okay, thank you to all our panelists, and especially here for us.